The lavender-scented mist hung in the air, a clean, sterile veil over the vast living room of the penthouse. Aaliyah shifted her weight, a sharp ache blooming in her lower back as she reached to polish the streakless glass overlooking the Seoul skyline. At 8 months pregnant, every movement was a negotiation with her own body. A body she had tried so hard to keep invisible for nearly a year. The cleaning agency had called this a high-priority emergency, a vacant unit needing a final shine before the owner returned from a business trip. The heavy thud of the penthouse door clicking open shattered the silence. Aaliyah froze. Polished shoes clicked against the marble with a rhythmic, predatory precision she recognized in her very marrow. She didn't want to turn around. She prayed it was just the concierge, but then the scent hit her, sandalwood, rain, and the cold metallic edge of expensive cologne. The plastic spray bottle slipped from her numbed fingers. It hit the floor with a sharp, echoing clatter, the lavender liquid pooling around her worn sneakers. Everyone out. Now. The voice was a low vibration that seemed to rattle the floorboards. Aaliyah finally turned, her hand instinctively flying to the heavy, protective curve of her stomach. Miho Lee stood in the foyer, a towering silhouette of tailored charcoal wool and lethal intent. The tattoos on his neck, dark and intricate vines of power, seemed to pulse against his white collar. Behind him, his men in matching black suits stopped mid-stride, their expressions shifting from professional indifference to pure, unadulterated shock as they looked at the woman in the simple cleaning uniform. Miho didn't look at his men. He didn't look at the spilled cleaner. His gaze was a scorching brand, locked onto Aaliyah's face before dropping, with agonizing slowness, to the undeniable life she was carrying. The air in the room vanished. For 8 months, he had been a ghost in her nightmares. Now he was 6 feet of fury and something that looked terrifyingly like heartbreak. He stepped over the threshold, the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows catching the glint of his watch as he moved into her space. His hand, the one that had once held her in the dark and signed the lethal orders of the Lee Syndicate, reached out. It didn't reach for a weapon. It reached for her, and as it hovered near her wrist, Aaliyah saw it. The slight, unmistakable tremble of a man whose world had just been leveled by a single clatter of plastic on stone. Aaliyah, he rasped, the name sounding like a prayer and a threat all at once. Tell me I am dreaming. Would you like me to write the next chapter? Where Miho discovers the truth behind Aaliyah's disappearance. The tea room of the Lee estate had always been a place of cold, stifling beauty, smelling of dried hibiscus and the ancient, polished wood of the ancestors. 8 months ago, it became the room where Aaliyah's world ended. She had been sitting by the window, watching the moonlight silver the koi pond, waiting for Miho to return from a high-stakes meeting. She had his favorite tea steeping, the steam rising in delicate curls that matched the peace in her heart. A peace that was shattered the moment the sliding door moved with a sharp, unforgiving click. Madame Lee did not walk. She glided, a ghost of old-world authority dressed in silk that hissed against the floor like a warning. She didn't look at Aaliyah. Instead, she sat with a rigid, terrifying grace, her eyes fixed on the dossier she placed on the low table. It was thick, filled with surveillance photos of Miho, not in his boardroom, but with Aaliyah in their private moments. My son is a king in a world of wolves, Madame Lee began, her voice as thin and sharp as a razor. And you are the wound that makes him bleed. Aaliyah had tried to speak, to defend the love that Miho called his only truth, but the older woman raised a single pale hand. The silence that followed was heavy with a threat Aaliyah could feel in her bones. Madame Lee opened the dossier to a photo of a rival cartel's inner circle. They were looking at a screen, the same surveillance footage of Miho and Aaliyah. The elders have already cast their votes, Aaliyah. They see his hidden wife as a liability. They believe he is soft because he spends his nights protecting you instead of expanding the borders of the syndicate. Tonight, 3 rival families moved their men into the Gangnam district. They aren't going for the docks or the warehouses. They are waiting for him to step into his car to come home to you. The air in the room grew cold as Madame Lee leaned forward, her eyes as vacant and lethal as the barrels of the guns her son's men carried. If you stay, he will fight for you. He will burn his empire to the ground to keep you, and in the fire, he will be executed. Your love is his death warrant. But if you sign these papers, if you vanish tonight, I will call off the elders. I will ensure the rivals see him as the cold, untouchable leader he was born to be. I will save his life by killing his heart. Aaliyah looked at the wedding ring on her finger, the gold reflecting the dim light of the room. She thought of Miho's laugh, the way he tucked her hair behind her ear when the world felt too loud, and the secret life they were building. She didn't know then that she was already carrying his heir. She only knew that she couldn't let him die for a girl from a world he didn't belong to. He will look for me, Aaliyah whispered, her heart fracturing in real time. Let him look, Madame Lee replied, sliding a fountain pen across the table. By the time he finds the trail cold, he will be too powerful for anyone to touch. You are a mistake, Aaliyah. An American dream that has no place in a Korean dynasty. Sign and he lives. Stay, and I will be choosing his casket by morning. That night, Aaliyah didn't pack her books or her clothes. She only took the small bag she had arrived with and left her ring on the kitchen counter, next to the cold, forgotten tea. She walked out of the estate and into the rain, disappearing into the shadows of Seoul, leaving behind the only man she had ever loved to ensure he would live to be hated by the rest of the world. She had chosen his life over their happiness, never knowing that her disappearance would turn the Ice King into something far more dangerous than his mother had ever imagined. Would you like me to write the next chapter, covering the heartbreaking night Aaliyah spent in a cheap motel discovering she was pregnant? The rain that night was a cold, relentless sheet that blurred the neon lights of the city into bleeding smears of red and blue. Aaliyah stood in the center of the kitchen, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. The dossier Madame Lee had left sat on the mahogany table, a silent witness to the choice she had just made. She looked down at the gold band on her finger, a simple, elegant circle that carried the weight of every promise Miho had ever whispered into her hair. With hands that shook uncontrollably, she slid it off. It felt like tearing off a piece of her own soul. She placed the ring in a small ceramic bowl of sugar on the counter, a place where he would find it first thing in the morning when he reached for his coffee. It was a cruel, quiet goodbye. She didn't write a note. No words could explain why she was abandoning the only man who had ever truly seen her. She only took her passport, a handful of cash she had saved, and a single sweater that still smelled faintly of his cologne. As she slipped out the service entrance, the chill of the night air hit her lungs, and for a moment she almost turned back. She could almost hear his voice, the low, steady timbre that anchored her. But then she remembered Madame Lee's eyes, the conviction that her love was a target painted on his back. She stepped into the downpour, her silhouette swallowed by the shadows of the estate's high walls. Less than an hour later, the tires of Miho's car screeched against the wet pavement of the driveway. He was home early, driven by a restless unease he couldn't name. He burst through the front door, his coat damp, his eyes already searching for her. "Aaliyah," he called out, his voice echoing through the vaulted halls. Silence was his only answer. He found the ring in the sugar bowl 10 minutes later. The sight of it, the gold gleaming against the white crystals, shattered the legendary composure of the Lee Syndicate's heir. He didn't scream, he didn't throw things. He simply went still, a terrifying, absolute stillness that usually preceded a massacre. He picked up the ring, his thumb tracing the engraving inside. "Find her," he whispered into the empty kitchen. By the time his men arrived, Miho was already at the monitors, his eyes manic as he watched the security footage. He saw her walk into the rain, saw the way her shoulders were hunched, and saw her disappear past the gate. He didn't care about the rivals moving into Gangnam. He didn't care about the board members waiting for his report. "I want every street camera, every bus terminal, and every subway station in this city under surveillance," he roared, his voice finally breaking. "I want her back. If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will burn every district in this city until there is nothing left but ash. Find my wife." That night, the Ice King of Seoul died, and a monster was born. While Aaliyah shivered in the back of a taxi, heading toward a part of the city where the Lee name carried no weight, Miho was tearing the world apart to find the piece of himself he had just lost. He didn't know yet that she was carrying his future, but he already knew that without her, he had no future at all. The rain was a relentless, cold sheet that blurred the Seoul skyline into smears of neon red and electric blue. Inside the Lee estate, the air was unnervingly still, smelling of the expensive jasmine incense Madame Lee had left behind like a floral shroud. Aaliyah stood in the center of the kitchen, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. The mahogany counter felt ice-cold beneath her palms. She looked down at the gold band on her finger. The only thing in this house that felt real, a simple, elegant circle that carried the weight of every whispered promise Miho had ever made in the dark. Her hands shook as she gripped the metal. It felt like trying to peel off a piece of her own soul. With a sharp, hitching breath, she slid the ring off. The weight of its absence was immediate, a heavy phantom void that made her arm feel leaden. She looked at the small ceramic bowl of sugar near the espresso machine, the place where he would find it first thing in the morning when he reached for his coffee, before the world demanded he be the Ice King. She tucked the ring deep into the white crystals, burying the evidence of their love, as if it were a secret that could no longer exist in the light of day. She didn't write a note. No words could explain that she was abandoning him to save him. She took only her passport, a handful of cash, and a single sweater that still held the faint, woody scent of his cologne. As she slipped out the service entrance, the midnight air hit her lungs like a physical blow. She didn't look back at the high stone walls or the security cameras she knew were watching. She stepped into the downpour, her silhouette swallowed by the shadows of the street, a ghost leaving behind a king. Less than an hour later, the tires of a black Mercedes screeched against the wet pavement of the driveway. Miho Lee was home early, driven by a gnawing restlessness that had made him cut a board meeting short. He burst through the front door, his coat damp, his eyes already searching the dimly lit halls for the woman who made the blood in his veins feel warm. "Aaliyah," he called, his voice low and expectant, the tone he only used when they were alone. The silence that answered him was absolute. He walked into the kitchen, his senses on high alert. He noticed the lack of tea on the stove, the absence of her humming. His gaze drifted to the counter. He saw the sugar bowl moved an inch from its usual spot. He didn't know why his breath caught, but he reached out, his fingers digging into the sugar until they hit the cold, hard gold. The sight of the ring, his ring, lying in the white granules shattered the legendary composure of the Lee Syndicate's air. He didn't scream. He didn't break the expensive porcelain. He simply went still. A terrifying frozen stillness that usually preceded a massacre. He gripped the ring so hard the gold bit into his palm. "Find her," he whispered, the command barely more than a rasp. Within minutes, the house was swarming with men in black suits. The peaceful sanctuary was gone, replaced by the clinical efficiency of an underworld operation. Miho stood at the security monitors in the study, his eyes manic as he rewound the footage. He watched her walk into the rain, watched the way her shoulders were hunched, and saw the exact moment she vanished past the gate. "I want every street camera in Gangnam. I want every bus terminal, every subway station, and every highway toll monitored," he roared, his voice finally breaking with a raw, feral grief. "I don't care about the rivals. I don't care about the board. If a single hair on her head is harmed by this city, I will burn every district until there is nothing left but ash. Find my wife." That night, the man Aaliyah loved, the one who made her coffee and listened to her dreams, disappeared. In his place was a monster with a crown of thorns and a heart of ice. While Aaliyah shivered in the back of a taxi, heading toward a part of the city where the Lee name was only a whisper of fear, Miho Lee was tearing the world apart to find the piece of himself she had taken with her. He didn't know yet that she was carrying his future, but he already knew that without her, he had no reason to stay the man she had loved. The silence of the city was never truly silent. It was a low humming roar of traffic and distant sirens that served as the backdrop for Aaliyah's new, invisible life. She had traded the marble halls of the Lee estate for a room in a decaying building in a corner of the city where the sun rarely reached the pavement. The walls were so thin she could hear her neighbor's television and the rhythmic drip of a leaky pipe in the communal hallway, a stark rhythmic reminder of everything she had lost. The first month had been a blur of terror and nausea. She had spent her first nights in a windowless motel, clutching her stomach and jumping at every heavy footstep in the corridor. It was there, under the flickering hum of a yellowed fluorescent light, that the plastic stick had confirmed what her body already knew. She was pregnant. She had sat on the edge of a stained mattress, the cheap heater rattling in the corner, and wept until her throat was raw. She was carrying the heir to the lease syndicate in a room that cost $40 a night, and the man who should have been holding her hand was likely tearing the world apart to find her, or worse, forgetting her to satisfy his mother's demands. Survival became a mechanical process. She found the apartment. A single room barely wide enough to stretch her arms across, and a job with an agency that didn't ask for a resident card as long as she was willing to scrub the floors no one else wanted to touch. She learned the art of disappearing. She wore oversized hoodies even in the humid heat of the Seoul summer, hiding the growing curve of her waist. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the pavement, walking miles to avoid the subway cameras Miho surely monitored. By the 5th month, the physical toll began to set in. Her feet, once accustomed to designer heels, now throbbed and swelled inside cheap sneakers bought from a street market. Every morning, the alarm clock was a physical blow, demanding she rise and haul her heavy body to another luxury high-rise to clean up the lives of people who didn't even see her. She became an expert in the service entrance life, a ghost moving through service elevators and back hallways, smelling of bleach and industrial lavender. Some nights, when the baby kicked so hard it took her breath away, she would lie on her narrow cot and whisper into the dark. "He's a dangerous man, little one," she would murmur, her hand resting on the tight skin of her belly. "But he would have loved you. He would have given you the moon if you'd asked for it." She lived on convenience store kimbap and instant ramen, saving everyone for the day the baby would arrive, terrified of the moment she would have to step into a hospital and risk a paper trail that would lead Madame Lee straight to her door. The silence grew heavier as the 8th month approached. Her back was a constant, searing ache, and her breath came short as the baby took up more space. She felt like a glass ornament held together by Scotch tape, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. She had spent 240 days without hearing his voice, without the scent of his cologne, and without the feeling of his hand protecting her. She had convinced herself that her invisibility was her only safety, a shield that kept Miho alive and her baby hidden. But as she stood in the dark of her tiny room, looking at the assignment for the following morning, a high-priority cleaning job at a penthouse in Hanamdong, she didn't feel safe. She felt a strange, cold shiver of fate. She didn't know the owner's name, only that the pay was triple her usual rate. She closed her eyes, exhausted and desperate, unaware that the 8 months of silence were about to end with a single shattering clatter of a spray bottle on a marble floor. Miho didn't let her walk to the study. Despite her soft protests, he gathered her into his arms, his movements a blend of terrifying strength and a tenderness that made her heart ache. He settled her into the oversized leather chair behind his mahogany desk, the seat of his power, and knelt before her. He didn't care about the spilled cleaner on his suit or the chaos in the hallway. His world had narrowed down to the woman in front of him and the air she breathed. "Show me," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "The papers she gave you. The photos. Everything." Aaliyah reached into the pocket of her cleaning apron and pulled out a worn, yellowed envelope she had carried like a curse for 8 months. Her hands trembled as she handed it to him. Miho took it with a reverence that bordered on fear. He pulled out the documents, the finalized divorce decree, the abandonment papers, and the high-resolution surveillance photos of himself at a charity gala, looking intimate with the daughter of a rival syndicate. As his eyes scanned the legal jargon, his face transformed into a mask of pure, cold marble. He stood up, his height blocking out the light of the sunset. He moved to his computer, his fingers flying across the keys with a lethal efficiency. He bypassed 3 layers of syndicate encryption to reach the family's private legal archives. "Look at this, Aaliyah," he said, his voice dropping to a pitch that signaled a coming storm. He turned the monitor toward her. On the screen was the original file for the divorce petition. He zoomed in on the signature line. Beside it, he pulled up a digitized copy of his actual signature from a recent merger contract. To an untrained eye, they were identical, but Miho pointed to a microscopic tremor in the loop of the L. And the way the ink pooled at the end of the stroke. "It's a digital forgery," he rasped, the words sounding like breaking glass. "A high-level scan and replicate job. Only 3 people in this city have the clearance to access the family seal, and the encryption keys required to file this without my terminal alerting me. My mother is one of them." He clicked another window, pulling up the metadata for the surveillance photos. The timestamps didn't match the gala dates. They were composites, layered images created to make a business greeting look like a lover's embrace. He realized then that while he had been tearing the city apart, scouring the slums and the docks for a trace of his wife, his own mother had been sitting across from him at dinner, watching him bleed and offering him tea. The silence in the study grew heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a massacre. Miho didn't roar. He didn't sweep the items off his desk. He simply turned off the monitor and looked at Aaliyah. The Ice King was gone, replaced by a man who had realized that his own blood had poisoned his well. "She used my name to kill our life," he whispered, his eyes glowing with a dark, predatory light. "She convinced you that I was the one who threw you away. She used my power to make you believe I was your predator instead of your protector." He walked back to her, taking her face in his large, tattooed hands. His thumbs traced the dark circles under her eyes, evidence of the 8 months of survival he had inadvertently forced upon her. "I thought I was fighting rivals for my throne, Aaliyah. I thought I was protecting you from enemies at the gate. But the enemy was inside the house, wearing a silk hanbok and calling herself my mother." He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. His breathing was ragged, the sound of a man who had finally found the target for all the rage he had been carrying. She wanted a pure dynasty. She wanted a leader who had no heart left to break. She's about to find out that a man with nothing to lose is dangerous, but a man who has just found everything he thought he'd lost is a goddamn monster. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over a speed dial contact that would signal the beginning of the end for Madame Lee's influence. "We aren't hiding anymore. Tonight the board meets. Tonight, the city learns that there is no Lee syndicate without the woman who carried my heir through the mud, while I was too blind to see the snakes in my own garden. Would you like me to write the next chapter, where Miho turns the penthouse into a private medical fortress and begins his systematic dismantling of his mother's power?" The roar of Miho's fury was still vibrating in the air when Aaliyah's world began to tilt. The high-definition monitors, the mahogany desk, and the sharp tattooed lines of Miho's face blurred into a kaleidoscopic smear of gray and charcoal. She tried to take a breath, but it caught in her throat, strangled by a sudden searing spike of pain that radiated from her lower back and tightened across her abdomen like a vice. "Aaliyah!" Miho's voice, which had been a lethal promise of destruction seconds before, cracked with immediate raw terror. She didn't have the strength to answer. A cold, prickling sweat broke across her forehead, and her knees, already weakened by months of standing on hard marble floors, finally gave way. She didn't hit the ground. Miho was there before she could even gasp, his large hands catching her with a desperation that nearly knocked the wind out of him. He pulled her against his chest, his heart hammering against her ear, a frantic, uneven rhythm that matched her own. "The baby," she managed to whisper, her fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his suit. "Miho, something's wrong." The Ice King vanished. In his place was a man who looked like he had been struck by lightning. He scooped her up, his movements no longer calculated or powerful but frantic. He didn't take her to the elevator. He didn't trust the world outside. He carried her back into the master bedroom, laying her onto the silk sheets she had once called home, while he barked orders into his phone that sounded like battle cries. "I don't care about the board. I don't care about the docks," he roared into the receiver. "Get Dr. Han here now. If his car isn't in the driveway in 5 minutes, I'll send a helicopter to pick him up from the middle of the street. Move." Within 20 minutes, the penthouse, once a cold monument to Miho's solitary power, was transformed into a sterile high-tech fortress of medicine. Crates of medical equipment were wheeled in by silent men in suits, and the hum of monitors began to fill the space where silence had reigned for 8 months. Dr. Han, a man who had treated the syndicate's most violent wounds, looked at Aaliyah's pale face and the monitors tracking the baby's erratic heartbeat, and his expression went grim. Stress-induced crisis, the doctor murmured, his eyes flickering toward Miho, who was pacing at the foot of the bed like a caged predator. Her blood pressure is dangerously high. Her body is exhausted, Miho. She's malnourished, dehydrated, and her heart is trying to do the work of two people with no fuel left. Another few days of that cleaning job, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. Miho stopped mid-stride. He looked at Aaliyah, so small amidst the luxury he had provided, her arm hooked to and for drip, her breathing shallow. The realization hit him with a physical force that made him stagger. His pursuit of power and his family's greed had nearly killed the only two things that made his life worth living. He walked to the side of the bed and knelt, taking her hand in both of his. He didn't care that the doctor was watching. He didn't care that his empire was waiting for his command. "I'm here," he whispered, his forehead resting against the back of her hand. "I'm not leaving. I don't care if the whole city burns to the ground, Aaliyah. You stay with me. Do you hear me? You stay." He stayed there for hours, a sentinel in a custom suit, refusing to eat or sleep. Every time she flinched in her sleep, his grip tightened. He had been ready to dismantle his mother's world with phone calls and board meetings. But as he watched the steady, fragile drip of the four, he realized the true price of his crown. He had spent his life being a monster so no one could hurt him, only to find that the most dangerous weapon in the world was the silence he had allowed to grow between them. He wouldn't leave her side again, not for the throne and not even for revenge. The roar of Miho's fury was still vibrating in the air when Aaliyah's world began to tilt. The high-definition monitors, the mahogany desk, and the sharp tattooed lines of Miho's face blurred into a kaleidoscopic smear of gray and charcoal. She tried to take a breath, but it caught in her throat, strangled by a sudden searing spike of pain that radiated from her lower back and tightened across her abdomen like a cold iron vice. "Aaliyah!" Miho's voice, which had been a lethal promise of destruction seconds before, cracked with immediate raw terror. She didn't have the strength to answer. A cold, prickling sweat broke across her forehead, and her knees, already weakened by 8 months of standing on hard marble floors and walking miles to save on bus fare, finally gave way. She didn't hit the ground. Miho was there before she could even gasp, his large hands catching her with a desperation that nearly knocked the wind out of him. He pulled her against his chest, his heart hammering against her ear, a frantic, uneven rhythm that matched the panic rising in her own chest. "The baby," she managed to whisper, her fingers digging into the expensive dark fabric of his suit. "Miho, something's wrong. It hurts." The Ice King vanished. In his place was a man who looked like he had been struck by lightning. He scooped her up, his movements no longer calculated or powerful, but frantic and trembling. He didn't take her to the elevator. He didn't trust the world outside or the time it would take to navigate the city. He carried her back into the master bedroom, laying her onto the silk sheets she had once called home, while he barked orders into his phone that sounded like battle cries. "I don't care about the board. I don't care about the docks," he roared into the receiver, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceilings of the penthouse. "Get Dr. Han here now. If his car isn't in the driveway in 5 minutes, I'll send a helicopter to pick him up from the middle of the street. Move." Within 20 minutes, the penthouse, once a cold monument to Miho's solitary power, was transformed into a sterile high-tech fortress of medicine. Crates of medical equipment were wheeled in by silent men in black suits, and the hum of fetal monitors began to fill the space where silence had reigned for months. Dr. Han, a man who had treated the syndicate's most violent wounds, looked at Aaliyah's pale face and the monitors tracking the baby's erratic heartbeat, and his expression went grim. "Stress-induced crisis," the doctor murmured, his eyes flickering toward Miho, who was pacing at the foot of the bed like a caged predator. "Her blood pressure is dangerously high. It's preeclampsia, Miho. Her body is exhausted. She's malnourished, dehydrated, and her heart is trying to do the work of two people with no fuel left. Another few days of that cleaning job, and we wouldn't be having this conversation." She was essentially working herself to death. Miho stopped mid-stride. The silence that followed was more terrifying than his shouting. He looked at Aaliyah, so small amidst the luxury he had provided, her arm hooked to and for drip, her breathing shallow and labored. The realization hit him with a physical force that made him stagger. His pursuit of power and his family's greed had nearly killed the only two things that made his life worth living. He had been so focused on the crown that he hadn't seen the queen bleeding at his feet. He walked to the side of the bed and knelt, taking her hand in both of his. He didn't care that the doctor was watching. He didn't care that his men were standing guard at the door, witnessing their boss's absolute undoing. "I'm here," he whispered, his forehead resting against the back of her hand, his voice thick with a grief he had suppressed for 8 months. "I'm not leaving. I don't care if the whole city burns to the ground, Aaliyah. You stay with me. Do you hear me? You and our child stay." He stayed there for hours, a sentinel in a custom suit, refusing to eat or sleep. Every time she flinched in her sleep, his grip tightened, his eyes never leaving her face. He had been ready to dismantle his mother's world with phone calls and board meetings, but as he watched the steady, fragile drip of the four, he realized the true price of his legacy. He had spent his life being a monster so no one could hurt him, only to find that the most dangerous weapon in the world was the distance his family had forced between them. He wouldn't leave her side again, not for the throne and not even for revenge. The reckoning could wait. His family was fighting for their lives. The air in the living area of the penthouse was thick with the scent of high-end cigar smoke and the metallic chill of impending violence. The board members of the Lee Syndicate sat in a semicircle of leather and chrome, their faces carved from granite, representing the old world of Seoul's underworld. At the center stood Madame Lee, her silk hanbok a masterpiece of emerald and gold, a queen mother waiting to reclaim her wayward son. She had no idea she was standing in the middle of a graveyard. Miho stepped into the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate against the marble. He didn't sit and he didn't offer tea. He simply tapped a sequence on his tablet, and a series of high-definition screens descended from the ceiling, displaying the raw, bleeding metadata of his mother's treachery. "In the last 3 minutes," Miho began, his voice a low, vibrating hum of lethal intent, "your offshore accounts in Switzerland have been frozen. The deed to the estate in Busan? Transferred. Your controlling shares in the shipping conglomerate? Liquidated and redistributed to the security teams you tried to bypass." Madame Lee's composure cracked, her eyes widening as the reality of her sudden poverty set in. She tried to speak, her hand flying to the jade pendant at her throat. "Miho, you wouldn't." "I already have." He cut her off, his voice like breaking glass. "You used my signature to destroy my life. Now I am using mine to erase your existence. You aren't a member of this board anymore. You aren't even a Lee. You are a ghost." He signaled to the double doors of the master suite. They swung open with a clinical hiss. There stood Aaliyah, supported by a specialized medical chair, draped in a cashmere blanket that felt like a cloud against her skin. Her 4 poles stood beside her like a silver scepter, and though her face was pale, her gaze was steady and unbreakable. Miho walked over to her, standing behind her and placing his large, tattooed hands on her shoulders in a clear mark of possession and protection. The contrast between his dark suit and her radiant presence was a silent roar to the room. "This is Aaliyah Grant Lee," he announced to the men who held the city's strings. The words echoed with the finality of a gavel. "She is the mother of the next head of this family. She is my wife, and she is the only reason I haven't leveled every building you own today. From this moment on, her word is my word. Her safety is the only law of this syndicate." He looked at the elders, his eyes glowing with a dark, predatory light. "Bow." One by one, the most dangerous men in Seoul stood and lowered their heads in deep, terrified respect. Madame Lee stood alone in the center of the room, a relic of a dynasty that had just been overthrown by the very love she had tried to kill. "You have 24 hours to leave Seoul," Miho whispered, his gaze never leaving Aaliyah's reflection in the window. "If I see your face in this city again, I will forget we share blood. The Ice King doesn't have a mother. He only has a queen." The room emptied in a rush of terrified silence. As the heavy doors sealed them in, Miho knelt beside Aaliyah, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing finally slowing. The empire was hers. He was merely its sword. The sterile hum of the medical monitors in the master suite was the only sound that dared to defy the heavy, oppressive silence of the penthouse. Outside those doors, Miho Lee was a god of the underworld. A man whose word could shift the tides of the global economy, or end a life with a single nod. But inside this room, standing by the bed where Aaliyah lay, he felt like a ghost. Formless, powerless, and utterly hollow. The empire he had fought so hard to reclaim, the syndicate he had just purged of his own mother's influence, felt like a handful of ash compared to the fragile, rhythmic beat of Aaliyah's heart on the screen. The crisis had escalated within minutes of the board member's departure. The temporary stability Aaliyah had found was shattered by the sheer physical toll of her 8-month ordeal. Her breath was coming in short, terrifying hitches, her skin a pale contrast to the deep charcoal of the silk sheets. "Miho," she gasped, her hand tightening around his with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone so exhausted. "Something is. It's starting. I can't. It hurts too much." Dr. Han didn't look up from the monitor, his face a mask of clinical focus. "Her blood pressure is spiking again. The preeclampsia is moving into a dangerous stage. We can't wait for a natural progression. The stress has triggered labor, but her body is too weak to sustain it. We have to deliver the baby now." "Do it," Miho said, his voice a low, vibrating rasp. He didn't move from Aaliyah's side, his large tattooed hand anchoring her to the bed. "Save them. Save them both, or I will burn this city until there is nothing left to treat." The room transformed into a blur of controlled chaos. Medical assistants moved with the silence of shadows, preparing the sterile field. The sharp, metallic scent of antiseptic began to overwhelm the sandalwood cologne Miho wore. Aaliyah's eyes were fixed on his, wide with a raw primal fear that mirrored his own. For 8 months she had survived in the dark, protecting this child with nothing but her own grit. Now at the finish line, she looked at the man she had run from, the man who was currently holding her hand as if it were the only thing keeping him on earth. "Look at me," Miho commanded, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. "Don't look at the machines. Don't look at the doctor. Just me, Aaliyah. I've got you. I'm never letting you go again." As the emergency procedure began, Miho felt the world outside the penthouse walls vanish. He didn't think about the docs he controlled, the billions in offshore accounts, or the rivals who were currently trembling at his name. He realized, with a clarity that felt like a blade to the chest, that he had spent his entire life building a throne made of ice and blood. He had thought power was the ability to control others, to be untouchable. But as he watched Aaliyah's face contort in pain, as he felt the desperate heat of her palm against his, he realized true power was the courage to be this vulnerable. He would trade every territory he owned for a single healthy cry from the child he hadn't yet met. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. The beeping of the monitors grew faster, a frantic staccato that seemed to mirror the racing of Miho's heart. He didn't realize he was praying until the words started to form in his mind, a desperate bargain with a universe he had long ago stopped believing in. "Take the empire. Take the name. Just leave me her. Just give me them." Then the sound broke through the silence. It was thin at first, a wet, struggling rasp that suddenly bloomed into a full-throated, healthy scream. The sound was more powerful than any explosion, more authoritative than any command Miho had ever given. Dr. Han moved with practiced ease, and a moment later, a small bundled shape was brought toward them. "A daughter," the doctor whispered, his own tension finally breaking into a tired smile. "She's small, but she's a fighter, Miho." The nurse placed the baby on Aaliyah's chest, and for a heartbeat time stopped. The frantic beeping slowed. The pain in Aaliyah's expression dissolved into a look of such pure, radiant wonder that Miho felt his knees finally buckle. He knelt by the bed, his eyes blurring as he looked at the tiny, perfect life they had created. A child of mixed heritage, a bridge between two worlds that had tried so hard to keep them apart. The baby's tiny hand moved, her fingers instinctively searching until they closed around Miho's thumb. The grip was small, but to Miho it felt like the weight of the entire world. He started to cry, the dangerous man, the monster of the soul underworld, weeping openly over the newborn daughter who had just made his entire empire look like a toy. "She looks like you," Miho whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he looked from his daughter to Aaliyah. Aaliyah reached out, her fingers brushing the ink on his hand, the marks of the man she had feared and loved in equal measure. "She has your attitude," she breathed, a weak but genuine smile touching her lips. "She's already demanding the room." Miho leaned over and kissed Aaliyah's forehead, then leaned down to press a soft kiss to his daughter's crown. In that moment, the Lee syndicate didn't exist. The mother who had betrayed him didn't exist. There was only this bed, this light, and this family. He had spent his life being a king of shadows, but as he looked at his wife and child, he realized he had finally stepped into the light. His empire was nothing. This was his everything. The grand hall of the Lee estate was transformed into a sanctuary of light and silk, scented with the fragrance of white lilies and the rich, earthy smoke of traditional incense. 2 months after the frantic night in the penthouse, the air of Seoul was cool, but inside the estate, it was thick with the warmth of a new beginning. Aaliyah stood before the mirror, her fingers tracing the intricate gold embroidery of the crimson hanbok that signified her status as the heart of the Lee family. Miho entered the room, shedding the sharp, modern silhouette of his Mafia suits for a traditional dress that made his syndicate tattoos look like the markings of an ancient king. He stopped at the doorway, his intense gaze softening into something that looked remarkably like a prayer as he looked at the woman who had survived the shadows to claim the throne beside him. The ceremony was a traditional piebeek, but it was small and intimate, attended only by those who had chosen to stand with Miho when his own mother had turned to ice. Madame Lee was long gone, her influence erased as completely as a footprint in the tide, and in her place sat a new family, a new choice. At the center of the room was Hyun Grace, their daughter, sleeping peacefully in a tiny hanbok of her own, a perfect blend of both their worlds and the living proof of their victory. As Miho and Aaliyah shared the traditional wedding cup, they weren't just honoring the past. They were forging a future that would no longer be dictated by bloodlines or old-world prejudices. When the time came for the vows, Miho spoke in both Korean and English, his voice resonating with a depth that reached every corner of the hall. 2 years ago I thought power was about control, he said, looking only at Aaliyah. But today I know it is about the courage to be vulnerable with you. He promised to honor and protect her until his last breath, declaring that she and Hyun Grace were his past, his present, and his entire future. Aaliyah, her eyes brimming with tears of joy rather than the fear she had carried for 8 months, replied that she had finally found her home in him. She vowed to build a world where their daughter would never have to hide who she was, choosing this life and the next beside the man who had burned his kingdom down to keep her safe. The celebration culminated on the rooftop of their penthouse, the city of Seoul glittering beneath them like a carpet of fallen stars. As the dangerous world below continued its frantic pace, Aaliyah rested her head on Miho's chest, watching their daughter sleep peacefully in her bassinet. The balance was finally found. A peaceful world above, built on the ashes of the lies that had tried to destroy them. Their story had been forged in the dangerous underworld of crime families, but it had proven that even the darkest chapters could lead to the most beautiful endings.